Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit, and welcome to a preview of the upcoming game Eisenhorn XENOS, which is yet another Warhammer 40,000 title. I was able to have a look at this a couple of days before anybody else. It's a bit of an odd decision, honestly, by Pixel Hero Games, because this game is very, very clearly not finished yet. To the point where I don't believe it's going to be finished in the month that they've got before the release date in May. And yet they sent it to me anyway, who's frankly known to be fairly harsh on games that aren't all that good, especially when they were intended originally for mobile. Well, Eisenhorn XENOS still is, it's just they're bringing it out on PC first. Has this helped the game? Well, not based on this preview build, I'm afraid. There's an awful lot wrong with it, but let me set the scene for you and tell you why I'm looking at this in the first place. So, this is based on a novel called Eisenhorn. The first one of the trilogy, XENOS being the first one, or XENOS, whichever you like. And then you have Malleus, and you have Hereticus, which is the trilogy of Eisenhorn novels by Dan Abnett, who is a very accomplished writer, probably the most accomplished writer that currently still writes Warhammer 40,000 based fiction for the company Black Library, which I believe is a subsidiary of Games Workshop. And the Eisenhorn trilogy is considered by a lot of people to be one of the best 40,000 novels ever written. And there's a reason for that, because Eisenhorn is actually accessible for those that don't know anything about Warhammer 40,000, but still very enjoyable for those that do. It's kind of like a dark Sherlock Holmes in space. That's probably the best way to describe it. It's very procedural, it's very focused on investigation, whereas an awful lot of the Warhammer 40,000 fiction is basically rah-rah-rah Space Marine choppy-choppy, which is fun in and of its own right, but it's not exactly all that accomplished. Now, before I go on, I would like to point out that that thing down at the bottom left is not my bloody fault. That is Nvidia's fault. They enabled this in the latest version of the beta for GeForce Experience, if you happen to have sharing mode enabled. Not fun, not good. Nvidia, don't do that again. If you thought this was going to be free advertising for you, well, I've got news for you. Don't do that again. Alright, now I've got that nonsense out of the way. This is a 3D action-adventure title of sorts, which is based quite closely, very closely in fact, on the novel. And you can clearly tell that if you've read the novel by the fact that this is one of the opening sequences in which you are tasked with entering a cryogenic facility, chasing down a recidivist. What I will say about the initial opening is that in terms of its art direction, it seems to be quite accurate to the Warhammer 40,000 universe. It's pretty much how I would imagine Gregor Eisenhorn to be, which would not be difficult considering there are several pieces of art which depict him, and most of those are official. You got a couple of sort of tech adepts right there, and then you have one of Eisenhorn's many companions. Eisenhorn is an Imperial Inquisitor. The Inquisitor is, of course, tasked with hunting down heresy and various other nasty things. At the start of the series of novels, he is part of the Ordo XENOS, who are tasked in particular with hunting down alien infiltrators and alien influence upon the Imperium of Man, because of course aliens will lead the lamb astray, as it were. That said, the whole structure isn't necessarily strict, and Inquisitors can find themselves dealing with a wide variety of threats to the Imperium, including this fellow, who is not a very pleasant man. He's basically a psyker, or witch, I suppose is probably the best way to describe him. And he is quite clearly influenced in some way by chaos, although God Emperor knows how exactly. So, in terms of the gameplay, what you've got is a 3D action-adventure behind the shoulder, as you can see right here, and we're mostly just scanning things right now and triggering a few cutscenes. In terms of the voice acting, I'll let you hear a little bit more of it later, but what I will say is Gregor is very well voice acted from what I can see, but the other characters not necessarily. The tech priests in the opening sound very amateurish, as does your companion, I have to say, but the writing is pretty strong. Here's the thing, though. The writing is strong because it's lifted almost whole cloth from the novel. I recognize quite a few lines, even though I haven't read that book in about 5 years at least. And some of those lines are pretty memorable, and they're on display here. Now, you can argue that's a good thing, because those of you buying an Eisenhorn game are probably expecting an experience close to the novel, and yeah, you would be right, but it is definitely hard to compliment the writing when they didn't write it. Dan Abnett did. Unfortunately, the art design, the aesthetic, and the writing is kind of where the positives start to come to an end. Now, I mentioned earlier that this game was developed initially for mobile. When the announcement first came out in 2014, I believe, for this, it was stated that it was being developed for mobile devices. However, a recent change indicates that the game will be coming out first for PC. Now, this actually caused a little bit of consternation amongst the mobile crowd, as you might imagine, you know, if it was announced for your platform and then they delayed it to put it on a different platform, then yeah, you can expect people to get a little bit gnarly about that. I don't really blame them necessarily. But there was this bizarre rant on Touch Arcade about how they presumed there was some sort of desire to separate the mobile and PC version so that the PC version wouldn't appear to be tainted, because of course the PC crowd really hates anything that smells of mobile. Little bit of a bizarre rant, but not 100% off the mark. There's no doubt in my mind that games that were developed for mobile do not necessarily do all that well on Steam, especially if they look and play like a mobile game. But the thing is, it's not some sort of weird platform-based elitism. No, it's because games developed for mobile devices are generally inferior in terms of technology, in terms of interface, in terms of mechanics. Not always the case. There are certainly some games that came out on mobile first that do just fine on PC, but when it comes to action games on a touchscreen versus the action games that we expect on a PC, just bear in mind that Dark Souls 3 just came out. And this is the sort of game that, unfortunately, you're going to get compared to if you decide to make a third-person action title. Is that fair? Probably not. But ultimately, that's what consumers do. And the standard on PC is much higher because we have decades worth of development behind us. We have very accomplished and experienced studios developing titles for this platform, and we have a very precise set of control methods. So when combat like this kicks in, some people are going to turn around and say, uh-oh, and unfortunately I would be one of them. So what we have here is a so-called rhythm-based combat system, by which I mean it is a poor imitation of the Arkham system, as so many games these days are. Some of them are reasonable. Not inspired, but reasonable. In this case, what you've got is a system that is very, very basic. So the melee combat works as such. When you see the little yellow jewel on the screen, you click the button. You don't click the button when the jewel is red. You do click the button when it's yellow or green. And you also click the button when the enemy is attacking, and when a shield comes up, as you can see right there. And you'll be able to parry the blow. Very, very simple one-button melee combat. I wonder why it's one button, you might ask. Oh yes, it's for a mobile device on a touch screen. So it is to be expected that such a combat system would be implemented, because you can't really do God of War or Bayonetta properly on a touch screen, obviously. You'll also notice I'm not taking a great deal of damage, but this is the first level in the preview build. I can't imagine it was designed to be particularly difficult. Now, there is an element of range combat in there that you're going to see as well, but unfortunately that too is very basic. It doesn't actually involve any sort of aiming. You literally just click the right button until your magazine is spent, and it will do damage to the thing that it arbitrarily seemed to decide to lock onto. As far as I know, there doesn't appear to be a way to switch what you're locked onto directly. At least that was not part of the tutorial text, if there is, so it is hard to say. Unfortunately, this of course means that the combat system is unbelievably basic, not particularly enjoyable, and also lacks responsiveness, precision, and a lot of weight behind the swings. It feels like you're swinging a foam bat as opposed to a power sword. Now, this may not be the case later on in the game. It's entirely possible that they may, in the full game anyway, give you something like a thunder hammer or a chainsword or something along those lines, although it should be noted that for the most part, Eisenhorn in the novels does use a power sword, so it is unlikely that they will give you too much variety there, but the game does claim to have over 100 loot items. Now, the preview build lacks almost all of those, and it has placeholder icons for them. You're going to be able to see that in a moment once we get to the first sort of shopping node, I suppose is the best way to describe it. I'm not 100% sure why they do that, but it's not the only game to have just had a random node in the middle of a level that says, hey, you can inexplicably buy things from here. But for the most part, it's two weapons, one which is a clear upgrade over the other for melee, so it's Power Sword and Power Sword B. And you then have 3 guns, a stub gun, an auto gun, and a combat shotgun. I will buy the combat shotgun momentarily. I believe he just picked up either the stub gun or the auto pistol. I'm not sure which. I think it's a stub gun by the looks of it. And Then you have a bunch of different sort of sigils that you can equip, which will just give you flat-out bonus damage and bonus HP and so on and so forth. There is the ranged attack little tutorial there, and that's how ranged attacking works. It locks onto sort of what's in front of you, and you right-click a bunch of times, it automatically hits them. It's not particularly engaging, it's mechanically shallow, and frankly, it doesn't actually require any skill whatsoever other than a mild element of timing. Ooh, so far so not particularly brilliant, eh? Well, the combat system is not helped out by janky animation quality, as you can see. You've seen a couple of finishing animations. Some of them are okay, some of them are not. I will say the game is clearly a work in progress, so I'll give them to some degree the benefit of the doubt on that, but I also believe there's really only so much you can do in a month prior to the game coming out. And for me to enjoy this combat system, you'd have to rework the entire bloody thing, which honestly is not going to happen. Now, I'd say, hey, you should develop this like God of War or Bayonetta or a myriad of other excellent character action games, but let's be honest, that would not be realistic if you were initially planning to release this on mobile devices. So what do you do in that situation? Can you make a really good third-person action combat system on a mobile device? Well, not without serious sacrifices. I've made this argument before. This is the reason why I will never see eye to eye with Touch Arcade when they get very defensive about mobile games. It is simply a fact in my eyes that mobile games, when it comes to the traditional core genres, are going to be hamstrung by the control method. No doubt about it. I think it's very, very difficult to fix, and any game that has done controls well has generally compromised in order to make that happen. This game is similar in that regard, unfortunately, and since it's coming out on PC first, I have a feeling that it's going to get absolutely lambasted for this combat system, and really I wouldn't blame people for it because I don't like it either. What is the solution? Well, the solution, unfortunately, requires time travel and perhaps a little bit of foresight. And that is the idea that it shouldn't have been this genre in the first place. I think the best thing you could have done with a game like this is to create it as more of a narrative experience. Bear in mind, there's a lot of cutscenes here and there's a lot of writing. Rightfully so, because it's an Eisenhorn game. It's based on a novel, a trilogy of novels, in fact. It's got an awful lot of writing in it. It's got an awful lot of lines that are spoken, obviously. So, would you perhaps want to focus on that? Potentially. So what do? Well, maybe you could make it a point-and-click adventure. Weirdly enough, Eisenhorn, despite being a Warhammer 40,000 novel, as I mentioned earlier, is actually surprisingly narratively focused, as opposed to a lot of the other books from the Black Library. There's more investigation and more character development than there is actual combat, and I feel that you could have quite easily, as a result, created a point-and-click investigation-based game. I mean, hell, you could make a hidden object game out of this, honestly. Alternatively, you could create a Telltale-style narrative game. So you've got maybe a basic combat system or QTE-based fighting, which would probably work relatively well if properly animated. And then you can have some real-time consequence-focused dialogue systems, and the rest of it can be basic movement and then cutscenes. And you know what? That would probably work pretty well. And I'd have taken that for what it was, because it wasn't attempting to be anything more. The problem is that Eisenhorn in its current form is attempting to be a third-person character action-adventure game, and it fails the action bit, which is a fairly huge problem in my eyes. It's not to say that it doesn't have a couple of interesting ideas. I quite like the idea of scanning with the Auspex and trying to find things based on the pings of the device. And of course, it is suitably arcane looking, which is very suitable for the art style of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, which can be considered to be far future gothic, really, more so than anything. That works. And as I said, the writing's good and backed up by a strong lead voice actor, although the supporting cast does seem to be lacking in terms of talent. But outside of that, it doesn't really seem to have all that many interesting ideas. The one other aspect of combat, other than what I just showed you right there, that's buggy. You'll find that that actually stops my progress later on in the game. The only other interesting aspect of it, besides the whole will attack, which is basically just kind of a force push, is a hold your breath mechanic, which is quite similar, I suppose, in ways to the way that Red Dead Redemption did bullet time. So you slow everything down, you lock on targets, you get initially 3 points to spend targeting different people with your shotgun or your melee attack, and then you do 3 rapid attacks in succession, and then the meter recharges. Not a bad little system, but unfortunately, as you're going to see a little bit later, it lacks quality animations to back it up. Now, what I'm doing right here is purchasing some sigils and changing out my weapon. So I accidentally bought 2 combat shotguns. For some reason, it lets you buy multiple of the same weapon, despite the fact that you absolutely can't use them in tandem. So that's something they obviously need to fix. This is obviously not done. I mean, you can tell. You know, there's very little detail here. They haven't properly animated everything. Under the firearms section, everything looks like a bolt pistol, despite there not being a bolt pistol for sale. But it's work in progress. I can overlook that. The equipment system does seem to be incredibly basic, but frankly, I don't really have enough information to go on here when it comes to how it's going to work later. Speaking of not working, you can get stuck on those nodes very easily, and I do later to the point where I have to restart the game. Now, here's a little bit of the main villain's voice acting. It's a little dodgy.
What makes you think you can catch me this time, Gregor? You've failed so many times before.
I'm not exactly intimidated by that, I have to say, and now we have ourselves a little generic crawl under the super cooled Steam section, which is one of various generic mechanics and ideas that have been done 1,000 times before and are not particularly inspired and just really serve to slow the game down more so than anything else. What actually surprised me more than anything is just how much time is spent running and jumping as opposed to actually fighting anything. Now, I did say that the novels didn't necessarily focus on that, and they didn't. But in the novels, you also didn't have to traverse mile upon mile of grey corridors by pressing your W key. Alright, let's get a little bit of Gregor's voice acting. This is somewhat stronger than the villains.
Their frigid bodies sore with hibernation sickness, trapped in their caskets with no one to aid them. I bid Betancourt alert the custodians. Apparently, relief crews were on their way. But why? Why was Eisenhorn doing this?
That works, honestly. That is exactly how I would have expected Eisenhorn to sound, especially his younger self at any rate. And I think a lot of people will enjoy that if they have read the books. They're looking for this character to be brought to life on screen, which again could have been done with either a motion cartoon or a movie or something along those lines, and they decided to do it through a game, which is not necessarily bad. It's just the game that they attached it to is really lacking in many, many areas. I'm going to push forward towards the end to show you the boss fight for this. This preview build is only 2 levels. I'll show you towards the end of Mission 1. That will also allow you to see the hold your breath mechanic.
There's nowhere left to run, recidivist.
You cannot stop us, Inquisitor. Your Imperium's days are numbered.
Perhaps, but yours ends here.
That is one more S than is required in that sentence. Also, this guy is way too confident considering I murdered his minions with the greatest of ease earlier. That is not a great animation, so that's the hold your breath mechanic. You get to slow down time, spend a couple of points to do some damage, and we're just going to swing our power sword away here with Imperial Abandon. This will probably go down reasonably well on mobile because, let's be honest, the standards of those on mobile when it comes to genres like this are fairly low. I imagine the price tag will also match up to that particular expectation. On PC, I cannot imagine it will be as cheap because, let's be honest, that's what they do when it comes to releasing PC games. Now, that's not to say that the PC version is not superior. It obviously is. More precise control, although still very, very floaty in many ways, fairly inaccurate, not particularly responsive. But of course, it also has superior technology behind it. You've got higher resolutions, you've got higher frame rate, you've got various options such as turning on or off chromatic aberration, FXAA, unfortunately nothing more advanced than that available, upping the texture quality, shadows, and all that sort of thing. Unfortunately, the textures for the most part are not particularly brilliant. Thankfully, they are hidden somewhat by some nice effects, excessive blur as far as I can tell, and also some fairly nice lighting. But I've got to say, as much as I would like to play this through for the story, I would rather watch this game on YouTube, and that is unfortunately a pretty damning indictment of its current state. The combat system is just not enjoyable, and really, outside of that and QTEs and watching cutscenes, what exactly is there? Well, according to this preview build, not a great deal, I'm afraid. This is coming out in a month, and I understand that preview builds are supposed to be pretty ropey, but this is This is not going to be ready in a month. No, not at all. And unfortunately, to get it to the level that I want it to be at, it would require an entire overhaul, a complete redesign of the way combat works. That's really unfortunate. I hate to be the herald of woe, the bearer of bad news on this one, and I feel exceptionally bad for being given a preview build and then deciding to essentially crap all over it, but I'm sorry, that's my job. This is certainly no Space Marine, it's definitely no Battlefleet Gothic. We have had good 40,000 games, we're getting more of them this year, this just doesn't happen to be one of them, I'm afraid. Maybe it's worth picking up on mobile for a lower price once it comes out, simply just to experience the story. Maybe you can just deal with the tap, 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 simplistic shallow combat. Personally, I was looking for something better, and as of the preview build at any rate, that's not what I got. My name has been TotalBiscuit, thank you very much for watching. This has been a preview of the upcoming game Eisenhorn XENOS, which is going to be available first on PC and then mobile devices. I'd love to tell you it was better than it was, but I'm afraid it isn't. If you like this video, then by all means do feel free to click the like button. If you are a filthy heretic or possible Xenos, then do click the dislike button and the Inquisition will be stopping by. I'll see you next time.
Detain me. You understand?
An Inquisitor? Thousands are dead. This desecration, the highborn of hubris, violated by a...
A murderer. A follower of darkness who now lies dead under a plastic sheet on the upper landing platform. I mourn the great loss hubris has suffered tonight. But if I had not been here at all to raise the alarm, who knows what catastrophe Iclone may have wrought. Or even his overall ambition.
Iclone, the recidivist? You must brief me on this entire event.
I shall prepare a report and bring it to you. I will have questions for you too. But you have plenty to deal with right now. We made our way out. Betancourt presented the junior custodians with a formal register of evidence to be stored for my inspection. The list included the casket and the bodies of Iclone and his men. None would be tampered with or even searched until I had looked at them. Betancourt made these requirements abundantly clear. We took Vibben with us.